Welcome back to the Seamless Life. The Mokpok storage system from the previous video was originally built as a quick outdoor project. The low-end plywood received just one coat of interior wall paint, so the finish soon began to deteriorate. With no real waterproofing, I couldn't even clean it properly with a pressure washer. I lived with it for a while, but after 5 years, it was finally time to give it a proper makeover. So, how was I going to fix it? I spent about a month thinking it over. My first idea was melamine face panels, but there were simply too many panels to cover. A water-resistant base coat and paint was another option, but it was untested and would take more time. Then I thought of architectural film. It costs a little more, but the catalog includes products rated for exterior use. So this time, I decided to go with architectural film. For this makeover, I'll simply repaint the existing 2x lumber frame while replacing all of the drawer fronts. The current recessed handles leave small gaps where water can seep in, making it impossible to wash the cabinet properly. This time, I'll use J-shaped aluminum profile handles, commonly found on kitchen cabinets in Japan. For the exposed plywood edges, I'll use vinyl edge banding instead of wrapping them with the architectural film. It is simply easier to apply, and I have used this edge banding on several outdoor cabinets before without any issues with water resistance. I'm also rebuilding this upright piano-style lid. Normally, I would use a miter joint here to hide the exposed plywood edge. But since the entire surface will be covered with architectural film, a simple butt joint is perfectly fine. I only needed to sand the edge smooth before applying the film. That is one of the great things about this type of finish. Once the edge banding is on, I mask the surface for the next step, then sand the edges flush, removing the excess banding at the same time. Architectural film generally does not adhere well when applied directly to bare wood, so a dedicated primer from the film manufacturer is required. There are several types available, but for this project, I used a thick, solvent-based primer designed for wooden surfaces. It dries very quickly, so about 30 minutes should be enough. For the finish, I chose an architectural film rated for exterior use. These films come in many different types, so I checked the manufacturer's catalog and selected one specifically approved for outdoor applications. Now I can apply the film. This is simply the method that works for me. I peel back about 1/3 of the backing paper and place the panel onto the exposed adhesive. Then I flip it over and apply the rest lengthwise, using a squeegee to push out any trapped air. Once the film is applied, I sand the edges with 240 grit sandpaper. This smooths and rounds the edge slightly, so there's nothing for your fingers to catch and start peeling the film away. Now for the tricky part, the piano-style lid. I tried applying the outer film using the same method as before, but it did not work. The film developed wrinkles that were too severe to push out with the squeegee. I managed to peel it back and try again, but with such a strong primer, you cannot always expect it to come off this cleanly. For the corner, I first press the film firmly along the edge with a rubber roller, then work it down across the flat surface. If you roll the large surface first, the film may lift around the corner later. Always start at the edge and work outward toward the end. Next, I moved on to the inside of the lid. Since I could not apply the film lengthwise, I started from the rear edge. But this turned out to be a complete failure. There was nowhere for the wrinkles to escape, and the surface ended up covered in creases. The better approach would have been to cut the film into separate pieces and apply it one face at a time. Well, that didn't go as planned, but hey, no one's gonna see it. I bought a full-length J-shaped aluminum profile and cut it to size myself. After switching the miter saw to a metal cutting blade, I made each cut with only light pressure. The profile is thin and cannot be clamped very tightly, so a gentle cut helps prevent it from slipping and leaving an angled cut. Next, I clean up the rough cut ends on the disc sander. Before and after, a huge difference. I finish the edges by hand, lightly smoothing them so they are not sharp enough to cause an injury. Then I drill the mounting holes, remove the burrs, and simply fasten the profile from the back with screws. I'm using truss head self-tapping screws. Unlike a box-style drawer, there is nothing behind the front panel for the screw heads to interfere with. Next, I'm adding a shallow top chest. I needed a dedicated place for the Makita battery chargers, so I decided to build it on top of the rack. For the two side supports, I reused some leftover 2x8 lumber from the original build 5 years ago. The center shelf fits into dados cut into the side supports. This is not really for added strength. The dados make it much easier to hold the correct dimensions during assembly. Construction lumber is often slightly twisted, so the joints locate the shelf while the screws pull everything into alignment. I cut the dados using only the sliding miter saw. With a caliper and a few careful adjustment cuts, it works perfectly well. The top chest needs an opening for the cables to pass down through, so I placed it as far out of sight as possible. I cut this notch with a jigsaw. Even a shape like this can be made by approaching it with several separate cuts. Alternatively, you could drill the corners first to give them a rounded finish. I'll cover these drawer fronts with architectural film as well. This time, instead of using separate edge banding, I'll wrap the film around all 4 edges. The basic process is the same as before, but I start with a larger piece of film and apply it to the main, face first. Then I cut the 4 corners and fold each side around the edge. Using the rubber roller, I work gradually around each corner in several passes rather than folding it all at once. Once the long edges are wrapped, I trim the corners and repeat the process on the short edges. After cutting away the excess film, I lightly sand the seams to blend them together. And here's the finished result. The seams are almost impossible to see. Now I can assemble the top chest. The dado joints help position the parts accurately, but simply driving in the screws is not enough to make the frame square. To correct this, I made the back panels from relatively thick material and cut them accurately square. During assembly, I clamped the frame against these panels, using them as a reference to pull the twisted lumber into alignment. I divided the back into 3 separate panels so the design can still accommodate some slight warping in the frame. I arranged everything I wanted to store inside the top chest to work out the layout. The LED work light attaches magnetically, and I wanted to secure it the same way while stored, so I screwed a thin steel plate inside the lid. I initially planned to cover the plate with architectural film, but that would reduce the magnetic holding force, so I decided to paint it instead. Since the surface needs to resist wear, I used a single-component automotive lacquer designed for car bodywork. I installed several surface-mounted outlets inside the chest. Rather than using a single large power strip, I planned the layout of the stored equipment first and placed outlets exactly where they were needed. Hiding all the wiring behind the rack would require disassembling it whenever I changed the layout. So instead, I kept the wiring accessible and protected it with surface-mounted cable raceways. The Makita chargers are mounted using the built-in keyhole slots on the back. However, pulling a battery upward can lift the charger off the mounting screws. So I added a small L angle above each charger to prevent it from sliding up. For the hinge, I used a continuous hinge that I already had on hand. Since this side will not normally be visible, I simply mounted it on the outside. It is stainless steel, so rust should not be an issue. The door opens upward, so I installed a locking lid stay to hold it open. The holding force can be increased by adding more stays, so I'll test it after installation and add another one if necessary. I noticed the cable was rubbing against the lid stay. To create some clearance, I made a spacer from aluminum composite panel and moved the stay slightly inward. With everything complete, it is time to install the top chest. It would have been too heavy and unsafe to lift with everything assembled, so I removed the lid and all of the contents before mounting it. The pocket holes in this area remain exposed, so I later covered them with a small aluminum plate fastened with screws. Most of the items inside the top chest are mounted with magnetic holders, allowing the layout to be changed easily later. The lid is secured with magnetic catches. It does not need a separate handle because the lower edge extends far enough to provide a built-in handhold. Next, I'll replace the parts on the lower cabinet. First, I removed the rubber sheet from the worktop. Since it was attached only with staples and no adhesive, it comes apart easily. I repainted only the visible areas of the frame. Unlike the Lauan plywood, the lumber had suffered very little damage and was still in relatively good condition. This piano-style lid also has no handle. When released, it lifts automatically with the help of gas springs. I used the manufacturer's formula and chose slightly stronger gas springs. To keep the lid securely closed, I installed toggle latches. For the new worktop, I bonded the rubber mat to an aluminum composite panel and fastened the panel with screws. This makes the entire worktop removable, so it can be taken out and washed thoroughly. I also made a small change to the drawer layout. The tool shown here is a motorcycle jack. I used it to force the frame apart so I could insert the new part between the sides. A jack like this is surprisingly useful for other jobs as well, such as lifting a storage shed. For this section, I used a removable cupboard instead of a drawer. It is held in place with magnets. And here is the finished result. This is how it looks after 2 years of use, and it still looks almost new. Since it sits in the carport, I clean it whenever I wash the car. I can rinse it directly with a pressure washer, blow off the remaining water, and wipe it dry. That is all it takes to make it look almost new again. I also added foam sealing tape around the lid to keep dust out, so the inside has stayed clean as well. Inside the piano-style lid, I built a folding holder for the impact wrenches. It uses folding shelf brackets and keeps the worktop clear while I'm working. In the next video, I'll build the side chests that I did not have time to cover here, with the goal of making them completely waterproof. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next project.